When I started getting serious about woodworking, I naturally wanted to invest in better chisels and other edge tools. And I was told by almost everyone I spoke to that I should find some old pre-World War II chisels because old steel was so much better than this modern garbage that we have today. I admit there's some charm in using vintage tools. As you can see, I've accumulated a few of them over the years. They're full of history. But are vintage chisels and other tools really better? Or is that just something that sentimental people say who think the old ways are always better than this dumpster fire of a world we live in today? Which would you rather own? A 100-year-old piece of Sheffield steel or a shiny new modern chisel? Now before you answer that, ask yourself, do you really know why Sheffield steel is so prized? It's a fascinating story that goes way, way back, and it helps explain why some of today's chisels might not be what you think they are. Once people figured out how to separate iron from all the rest of the junk in the raw ore, the Iron Age was born. Iron tools are much more durable than the old copper tools, but they're still relatively soft. However, if you can carefully control the level of carbon within the iron, you can make what's called carbon steel. So in early times, they heated the ore in a clay chimney called a bloomery to remove the oxides and produce a metal lump that they called bloom iron. You could hammer that into rough shape, but the charcoal fires used to heat that bloomery loaded up the lump with so much carbon that bloom iron was brittle and hardly even workable. So they'd heat it again, this time in a forge, and they would hammer it and fold it and hammer it over and over again, essentially burning the carbon out and creating a more workable material. They called that wrought iron, which literally means worked iron. Wrought iron has a very low carbon content because most of the carbon was just burnt out. That usually made the metal too soft for edge tools. Now, a very skilled smith might be able to leave just enough carbon in the iron to make a decent steel, but finding the right balance was a very difficult and inconsistent process. Eventually, someone figured out that you could put some carbon back in if you put some wrought iron and some charcoal in a sealed box and you cook them together for a long time in a very hot furnace. The charcoal would produce carbon-rich gases in the box, which would concentrate around the iron and form what looks like blisters on the surface. They called that blister steel. But most of the added carbon was just on the outside. So they would draw it out into thin sheets, then they'd cut it into pieces and stack those pieces into layers. Then they would heat and hammer the steel lasagna back into a solid chunk that contained layers of carbon throughout its thickness. This is called sheared steel, and it was a great improvement in tool making, but it was still very inconsistent due to the uneven distribution of the carbon, especially in the old days before additives were found to help those gases seep deeper into the iron. Shear steel was used in some tool making well into the 1800s, but perhaps the most important improvement in Western tool steel came back in the 1700s when a watchmaker who was just looking for better spring material came up with the process of using coke rather than coal to create extreme temperatures and melt blister steel into a sealed container called a crucible. By melting it, it was able to amalgamate the carbon in the iron in a much more consistent way. The molten steel was then poured into molds to make ingots, which could then be forged and shaped into tools. This was called cast steel or crucible steel. And if the process was done properly, it would contain just the right amount of carbon to give the properties needed for good tool making. This was a long process, and tool steel remained very expensive. In fact, it was common to forge weld a thin strip of good steel along the cutting edge of a wrought iron tool, such as this plane iron. You can see how it grows thicker near the bottom where the steel is attached to the iron. All that changed with the development of the Bessemer process. That involved blasting air into the molten metal to remove impurities through oxidation. It was faster and very large quantities could be produced at once, so tool steel became much less expensive. But now we're into the Industrial Revolution, the age of the railroads, and all the blast furnaces were busy turning out low-quality steel for railroad ties and other industrial necessities. They weren't making high-quality steel needed for edge tools like chisels. So smaller manufacturers responded by returning to the old crucible method, making high-quality steel but in smaller batches. Think of it like today's microbreweries, small businesses that make products for those who don't mind spending a little bit more for top quality. and many of these tool manufacturers at the time were centered in Sheffield, England. Unfortunately, the new blast and cast furnaces were just all the rage in those days, and so there was a perception that the older crucible-made steel was just lower quality. So some tool makers responded by stamping cast steel on their tools. They reminded customers that their methods still produced molten steel that was cast into ingots, just like the newfangled blast furnaces. That connection between old and new seemed to work, and the term cast steel became a sign of top quality in tool making. Some believe that that may have been the peak of tool making in the Western world. It's why 19th century tools, especially from Sheffield, England, particularly those marked cast steel, are so prized by woodworkers. But the story continues. This is one chisel's worth of high-quality tool steel. This is the culmination of hundreds of years worth of steel-making knowledge. It was made with modern methods that make it possible to carefully dial in the perfect balance of carbon and alloys with consistency that was just unheard of half a century ago. Some cheap tool factories might take this, melt it, and cast it into molds, and then grind it into a chisel shape. But good manufacturers still forge their tools in the old ways. They just use heat and a pneumatic hammer-like press. The Nubs factory in the Czech Republic does that, and they were nice enough to send me these samples so that you could see what the process is. Forging eliminates internal voids, it compresses the steel, and it aligns the grain structure along the shape of the tool, which affects its strength, just as the direction of wood grain can affect the strength of a furniture part. Forged tools take a keener edge and they resist dulling far better than other mass-produced tools. Once the steel is heated and hammered into shape, the excess is trimmed off to be recycled, and the blank now looks like a chisel. But it's not ready to sharpen yet. It has to be further hardened, because steel that is soft enough to forge into shape is not hard enough to hold the type of edge that woodworking requires. Hardening involves heating the tool to a specific temperature and holding it there for a specific amount of time. This alters its structure and causes the iron atoms to separate just enough for carbon atoms to squeeze in between them, where they're locked in place by quickly cooling or quenching the tool in oil or water. The result is steel that is often more dense and harder than ever before. In fact, at this point, the tool is still a bit too hard and too brittle. So it has to undergo another process called tempering that involves reheating it, but to a lower temperature, and allowing some of those atoms to relax again a little bit. The level of heat applied during the tempering process determines exactly how hard the steel will ultimately be. The goal is a tool that's hard enough to reduce edge wear, but not so hard that it'll be brittle. The hardness is graded on what's called a Rockwell scale, which at least for woodworking tools ranges from the low 50s to the high 60s. While lower quality tools might be on the low end of that scale, the real difference between cheap and high quality is in the consistency with which they can hit the specific hardness levels. And different tools are tempered to specific hardnesses for different purposes. For example, Nubs hardens their standard woodworking chisels to 59 because they want the tool to hold a sharp edge for a long time, but they also want the average person to be able to sharpen it easily. Another chisel may be hardened as high as 62, making it much more difficult to sharpen for the average person, but it will hold that edge longer, especially when working with very hard materials, and therefore require less frequent sharpenings. That's the balance tool makers have sought since the old bloom iron days centuries ago. A good tool has to be hard enough to be durable, but not so hard that it chips and shatters. On the other hand, it has to be soft enough to sharpen easily, but not so soft that the edge deforms when you try to cut hardwood. The last couple centuries have seen great leaps in steel making, including the addition of special alloys. Nubs, for example, adds chromium to their steel, which results in a finer grain, and it forms hard carbides that act like microscopic wear particles to keep the edge sharper for longer. They also add manganese, which, among other things, makes it possible to produce a keener edge without brittleness. On some of their tools, like their Richter line, they use a high-tech cryogenic hardening process, which produces a Rockwell 62 steel that will take a superfine edge. The old tool makers in Sheffield and elsewhere could never have imagined the alloys and the methods that we have today. So despite what the old-timers told me when I first started, modern chisels, like this one, are as good or even better than most steel from a century ago, and sometimes much less expensive as well. This Narex, for example, was like $12. Sure, there is a lot of junk steel out there, but if you know where to look, you'll find that we're living in a golden age of tool making right now. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with a vintage tool. Many of them are of excellent quality, and if you're like me, you enjoy the history that goes along with them. But you can buy a whole set of these for the price of 1 or 2 good vintage chisels, and they'll perform just as well or even better. If you want to see for yourself, I'll put some links to my favorite ones below. And not Amazon links. I buy mine from a small family business in Missouri that I partnered with years ago because they're just worth supporting. Check them out when you get a chance. In the meantime, you may have noticed I've been wearing this apron for the last several months. It might look normal to you, but it's special to me, and I think you'll agree when you hear its story. The apron itself is tough. It's well-fitting and comfortable. I love how the sawdust doesn't stick to it. It's not one of those $500 custom leather things that you're afraid to use. It's exactly what a hard-working shop apron should be. But the real story isn't about the apron itself. It's about where I got it. From a small family business also in Missouri called Dungarees. They started in 1999 by 2 brothers who were contractors that just didn't have access to decent selections of quality workwear. So they began selling their own out of a van. That was 25 years ago. And today they have 2 brick and mortar stores, and they have a comprehensive website that's dedicated to people who just need the right gear to get the job done all over the United States and even beyond. They carry only the best brands, and their focus is on quality and service. But most importantly, they've built a business that is employee-owned. The workers have an actual stake in the company. And I've met these folks. They act like a family over there. I love that. So please take a minute to visit their site using the link below the video. I'll be getting all my shop clothing from Dungarees moving forward, and I hope you'll consider supporting them too.